Welcome to the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's virtual learning studio in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Kathleen McDonald. The Pritzker Military Museum and Library's mission is to expand and grow into a place that inspires, engages, and informs everyone about military history, military affairs, and national security. Today's webinar, POWs in the Great War, is co-hosted by the National World War I Museum and Memorial. This will be recorded and available to the public on the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's Education on Demand YouTube channel. We are joined by Lora Vogt, Curator of Education and Interpretation at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, for a conversation surrounding the nearly 9 million people who were held as prisoners of war throughout 4 brutal years of World War I. Both sides imprisoned soldiers the world over, from the shores of Southeast Asia and the Siberian tundra to mere miles from the Western Front. So on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, it gives me great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Lora Vogt. She is, again, the Curator of Education and Interpretation at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, which was founded in 1926. It also holds the most comprehensive collection of the Great War artifacts in the world and has been ranked one of the top 25 museums in the country. As an educator and historian under Vogt's guidance, the museum and memorial has consistently broken records for public program engagement and educational participation. Along with internationally recognized exhibits and history resources, her work has been included in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NPR's All Things Considered. Lora holds a degree in history, secondary social studies education, and a master's in curriculum and instruction from the University of Missouri-Columbia. A secondary school teacher in Turkey and Missouri for 10 years, she has become a respected World War I authority who regularly speaks on behalf of the National World War I Museum and Memorial around the world. Welcome, Lora.
Kathleen, thank you so much. It really is. It's a true pleasure to be here and to be joining you all. We have for many years been partners with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, and it is spectacular to be continuing that educational mission together. Now, if you are joining online and you have the opportunity, Kathleen, remind me, what's the name of the exhibition that you all have right now in Chicago, and how long is that up?
It is Life Behind the Wire, Prisoners of War, and it is up through the end of April 2023.
Fantastic. As Curator of Education and Interpretation at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, one of the questions we always get is, why is the National World War I Museum and Memorial located in Kansas City, Missouri? So let me first address that, and also say, if you find yourself in and around Kansas City, we would love for you to join us here in that lovely tower and those 2 exterior buildings. You can also see the lovely entrance underneath. We are right in the midst of an expansion. And so if you come in May, you'll get a chance to see our large and new open collections storage space. But to answer the question, why is the National World War I Museum and Memorial located in Kansas City? It is because Kansas Cityans came together 2 weeks after the armistice of World War I to create a memorial for those who lived and those who died in the First World War. This is Memorial Hill in 1921, when it was dedicated by 5 major military leaders representing Belgium, Italy, France, Great Britain, and the United States. You might notice the gentleman second to the right is General John J. Pershing. And in 1926, we were opened with then President Calvin Coolidge speaking to the largest crowd any president had spoken to up until that date. And you can already see by the images of the generals that were there, and you can also see by the flags that we have represented around what we now call our U-shaped drive, that we have always been a space that has been not only committed to the American story in World War I, but the global story in World War I. And as we were looking past the centennial and looking at stories that needed to be told, we recognized within our collection that we've had since 1920, that is global in focus, that we had an extraordinary opportunity to talk about the experience of prisoners of war and what that was like over the course of kind of 4 years of tremendous warfare, 1914 through 1918. Now, if you know a lot about World War I, you might say, wait a second, it doesn't actually end in 1918. You might argue it ends in 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. But if you know even more about World War I, you would say, it certainly doesn't. It ends with one of those other treaties that also ended the war. We have, you've got 5 different treaties that ultimately end the war. One of them, the Treaty of Lausanne, being having a centennial in 2023. Or you might, as especially some of our experts at Pritzker Military Museum and Library, say, you know what, World War I never really ends. It just kind of becomes the beginning point of some of these wars that happen later on. And you'll see that there are some intersecting points between what happens with imprisonment in World War I and then how that informs what happens in imprisonment in World War II. And that certainly continues the story, as is the Pritzker Military Museum and Library's exhibition between with World War II and the Vietnam War. So I, as a good former classroom teacher, before we enter into kind of these conversations about the experiences of captivity in World War I, I'm going to go ahead and give you 3 things that I want you to remember and to know. First, imprisonment in World War I was the most commonly shared war experience. As Kathleen mentioned, many historians agree upon 9 million. Some say 8, some say 11 million. It's really difficult to get the exact number, but we do recognize that this is the most commonly shared war experience. It is global in scale. Every inhabited continent, Canada, spaces in South America, Japan, all of these spaces have camps where individuals will be imprisoned. And there is the use of large-scale internment. That's when you keep someone who is a non-combatant or a civilian for an arbitrary amount of time. All of this occurs really for the first time in World War I, right? It's nice to have the cheat sheet at the very beginning. So, global war, global captivity. Life behind the wire, whether in World War I or as Pritzker's current exhibition covers with World War II and Vietnam War, there's no story that's the same, yet each is going to share this universal longing for freedom and a return to better times. And from across the globe, we're going to be looking at different images and objects of World War I captives. And we're really kind of looking specifically through 1914 through 1919. Now, this war, this time frame, is a historic juncture. Prominent international military and diplomatic leaders had all relatively earlier, within the last decade or so, agreed to this very humane treatment of prisoners. And at the same right, with words like Hague and other things that might be familiar to both our students and our adults who are listening in. Innovation in industry and technology, things like modern transportation, large-scale logistics, all of those meant that there was a real change in scale. So we've got increasingly larger armies. We've got also the increased horrors of war. And it's going to change the scale and the duration of that captivity. Now, in World War I, long-term mass incarceration became a key outcome for the fighting. It's going to transform millions of individual lives, their families. It's going to set the stage for the modern process of war camps throughout the 20th century. So, global war. In July of 1914, as all of these empires around the world are going to war against each other, there's really no training how to be a good prisoner. And what I noticed actually is that the bottom of this, in my edit, the bottom of this photo has been taken out, where the gentlemen that you see in front, they are actually the guards. The gentlemen that you see in back, they are the prisoners. By January of 1915, there are almost 1.5 million prisoners of war that were being held by the two sides, right? So January of 1915, that's about 6 months, half a year after the war begins. This is a war that a lot of individuals, most nations, thought would be over by Christmas. And they end up with 1.5 million in captivity. And by 1919, occurring on an unprecedented scale, there's nearly 9 million captives on every inhabited continent. And you can see some more of this kind of global scale right there. Now, there's a really great website. One of the nice things about doing online conversations like this is that you all can absolutely multitask, as long as students or teachers totally agree to this concept. Consider taking a look at the website that I have over there in the left-hand corner, grandguerre.icrc.org. That's going to be the website of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And they have these fantastic archives, and they've got a wonderful interactive website that you can actually be taking a look at this global nature of where these different camps are located. You can see in my screenshot right there, you've got 251 that they're noting in Europe. You've got some all around. Now, there's no one comprehensive list of prisoners of wars and internment camp. We've actually got something that's a little bit more, that's got some more complexity. If you get a chance to visit us at the museum and memorial, we have a different map included within the exhibition itself. It, however, does not live online as something that is interactive. If you take a look on the right-hand side, right, you can see that there are camps in Japan, and from 1914 through 1918, German and Austro-Hungarian prisoners are going to be held after the fall of Tsingtao, and various actions, right? You can see that they're right there on the Pacific. So while there's not a lot of kind of the combat that happens in those spaces, there were prisons and imprisonment. And Japan in World War I was a model captor state. They provided exemplary care of prisoners. Were actually hailed as being some of the most humane and ethical spaces. They would be discussed after the war for the work that they did. Now, if you look over in the Russian Empire, you're going to see that there's not really a lot of camps that are noted on this map, but there were over 2 million prisoners who were captured by the Russian Empire. By the time the civil war within Russia is going to break out, you end up having many Austro-Hungarians who were living in the cold forests of Siberia. And then with the abrupt exit of Russia with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, then you have millions of individuals who in some instance have to circumnavigate the globe to find their own ways back home. If you take a look, and you can see kind of in the middle of the map, kind of in the Middle East, the British and British colonial troops, many of whom were captured in Mesopotamia, that's going to be modern day Iraq. Many of them had forced marches to what is, and I apologize, you can't see it in this map so well, what is modern day Syria. And then from there, they caught trains up into Turkey, where there were prison camps held as well. So again, and I'm going to go backwards here, you can see how you end up having these camps with individuals from all around the world. And when we talk about World War I as being really one of these first global wars, it's pretty easy to see when you start looking at some of the pictures like these. Now, this war is one that is really determined in many ways by geography, right? I just showed you guys that big world map. And while individual experiences, you can see all of these gentlemen right here, while individual experiences of imprisonment are going to vary, battle and geography are going to create clear patterns. The first is that on the Eastern Front, and in the early and late war years on the Western Front, significantly larger numbers of prisoners were captured with the large-scale movements that happened across fields, kind of like you see like this one, right? So on the Eastern Front, you don't have as much, you don't have as many trenches, you have much more large-scale movement that's occurring. That's going to be one of the reasons why there are far more Germans, Austro-Hungarians, and Russians captured than, say, the French and the British, because it is the Russians, the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans who are all fighting there along the Eastern Front. And what is most typical, again, is individuals being captured really in large groups, up to, in some instances, 100,000 people all at once. On the Western Front, with trench warfare, that's going to produce lower numbers of prisoners. Individuals might be captured, or small groups, when there were trench raids, when people were kind of jumping over to the other side to try to capture some folks for better intel, or it was actually really easy to get lost among the trenchscape that was occurring. So sometimes people would accidentally end up on the wrong side. I want to point out two things right here. One, I noted that there were 2 million people who were captured by the Russians. And you can see with this map, we don't have all of those prison camps by any stretch of the imagination. So when I mentioned that the list is not comprehensive, there are some outstanding historians who are currently and throughout the centennial have been working on things just like that. If you haven't had the opportunity to take a look at the Encyclopedia 1914-1918, it's one of the very best resources that came out of the centennial of World War I. And it provides a lot of articles, many of them by Heather Jones, who is one of the editors, who is also the historical advisor for this exhibition, that kind of really unpacks some of these different experiences from these different geographic regions. Also, take a look down on the continent of Africa. There are, when Africa, Asia, North America, Oceania, right, are around in this 1914 timeframe, but these major European powers go to war, these other spaces are compelled into this conflict. When France, Britain, Germany, Austro-Hungary all go to war in late July, early August of 1914. Nearly 3 million Africans are going to serve as combatants, porters, laborers, both in Africa and in Europe during the war. Now, if there are 3 million, we all know that some of them are going to become POWs. And yet we can all look at this map and realize, right, this is the importance of the geography classes and the history classes all kind of coming together. We can recognize that something is really missing right here. There's little information that exists about the experiences of being an African prisoner of war. And there are few objects that really show, that can really showcase some of that. So a couple of quick notes about this, and I love this cartoon from our collection. Now, only a minority of Africans are going to serve as soldiers in Europe. The majority are going to be placed into roles as laborers or porters, not because they weren't very skilled to be combatants, but because of the thinking of military leaders at the time. Now, what occurs is that as a laborer, as a porter, in a support position, you had no legal rights as a prisoner of war when you were captured by the enemy. So if you were captured or constrained, you could then be forced into unregistered labor for the enemy. African prisoners in Europe were also often registered by their religion or their status as a colonial soldier. So colonial soldiers, say, of France, instead of being registered by the actual combatant nation or with, the far broader term of African. Also, in African theaters of war, combatants were far more likely to die of injuries, of lack of medical care. If they made it to camp, if there was one, it was a very difficult experience. When we're talking about the geography of where you happened to be, of where you were deployed to fight, really impacts whether or not A, you become a prisoner of war, B, you become someone who is seen as a prisoner of war, and what that experience of imprisonment was like. Lastly, colonial attitudes, and this is again one of these cartoons of the era, so informative. Colonial attitudes are really going to inform the record keeping about African World War I participants. So there was bureaucratic disinterest in keeping accurate information about these men during wartime, which leaves us present-day historians with incomplete or non-existent data for our research today and for future research. If you like history, this is a really important area for people to be studying. There's a number of historians who are doing some really great work right now trying to find those stories and trying to locate those. So you'll see that there's going to be a lack of information about this if you come to our exhibit, as you see some of the images that I'm going to be able to use later on. As you look for books, it's not because they weren't there. It is because they weren't recorded in the same way and they didn't hold the same legal status. The third idea about global war and global captivity that I want to hit on before our break here is that a captured combatant is a prisoner of war. A captive civilian is an internee. And who you see right here, you actually see a number of internees. One of them is named Emil Jurg. And Emil Jurg was German, living in the United States. And because of a law that was sent out in Germany, if you were a German citizen, you were required to return to Germany to fight for the Germans. And this happens in 1914. So Emil Jurg, right at the very beginning of the war, though has connections and family in the United States, follows through with his legal requirement of citizenship, gets onto a ship to go back to Germany. And while he's doing that, his ship is stopped and he is in fact interned, not to be mistaken with interred. He is interned, he is imprisoned. He is imprisoned in the United Kingdom and spends the entirety of the war. Remember how long that is? 4 years. For wanting to be an honorable citizen of Germany, he spends 4 years of his life imprisoned until the war is over inside the United Kingdom. So my question to you all, and you can see right here, I apologize, I don't have it in my notes if he was in Nakalo or if he was in Douglas. There are 2 really extraordinary camps that existed at the time. But before I go any further, I'm going to actually leave you with a question. And one, if you are in a large group, to do hands, if you are able on that. Did the United States intern individuals during World War I? Were there internment camps inside the United States in World War I? If you think yes, raise your hand for me now. You think no? Of course not. Raise your hand for me right now. I will give you the answer after our quick break for questions. Kathleen, back to you.
Yes, so we don't have any submitted questions as of yet, but perhaps you could delve in a little bit more about what it was like being a prisoner in Russia and what the structure of their camps might have looked like being in Siberia. Because I imagine it's sort of like being in the desert. You wouldn't necessarily want to leave your shelter and any semblance of food supply to try and escape.
Yeah, absolutely not. And it really does depend, right? Russia is a very large country, and you have, as a matter of fact, the United States is even still, we still have service members who are in Russia, deployed to Russia in 1919, the summer of 1919. You can find out more about that if you look into kind of the polar bears and what that looks like. And it wasn't until 22 that I believe that Japan leaves Vladivostok. So it's going to be a tremendously different experience. However, the majority of prisoners who end up in Russia are going to sometimes be on trains for weeks, getting into some of those spaces. There are going to be some large-scale camps that are built for those purposes. Across, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but across the world, you have either these large-scale camps, which I'll show you some images of, that's a lot more familiar in our mind of what camp might look like. If anybody's seen any sort of movies about the Holocaust and those ideas of purpose-built camps where there's bunks and things like that line. That is this large rows of barracks back and forth. But a real key difference is that those camps those plans start in World War I, large scale, lots of people could leave the camp to work as kind of work camps, but the end goal was a humane existence and a humane way to take care of hundreds of thousands of people that you weren't planning on having there in the first place. Though horrendous, the majority of individuals survived their prisoner of war experience. And you'll see a couple of other images later on to really drive home that point. And across Russia, you have individuals who are really going to be pushed into working to help the war effort. And that is not only going to happen in Russia, it's going to happen in a variety of other places. You do have people who are going to perish. And I'm going to actually, because it's a really good question, let me pull up one and make sure that I get my note right when it comes to the numbers. You do have a number of individuals who are going to die in those spaces. The Murmansk Railway, which you had about 25,000 of the 70,000 mostly Austro-Hungarian prisoners who were set to work by the Russians in building the Murmansk Railway died. That's horrific, right? Horrific numbers. There's a color photo that was taken by kind of the pioneer photographer Sergei Brodkin-Gorsky, which, if again you're allowed to multitask right now, I would highly suggest taking a look for that. Great question.
You also mentioned that they were categorized by religion as going into some of the camps. Was there opportunity for them to practice their religious faith within the camps?
Kathleen, spectacular question. Yes, as a matter of fact, Germans in what is in English known as the crescent camp or the half moon camp, specifically built the first mosque. I know it's in Germany, it might be in all of Europe, for that purpose specifically, for individual combatants, for combatants who were Muslim and practicing, and then really tried to reach out to them through that idea of faith, to be able to see if they might make them kind of shift sides and fight on the side of the Central Powers. We have an online exhibition that will be available at the beginning part of 2023 that looks at that specifically. So put that down into the calendar. Go to our website, www.theworldwar.org, at the beginning part of next year. It'll be there on the front page that really does a deep dive. And I didn't even ask Kathleen to talk about this. I didn't set that question up. It does do this deep dive exploring faith and World War I. You'll also, this is slightly different, but if you ever get the chance to go to Europe, you'll have the opportunity to see that while there are attempts and places like in Germany where they were creating these spaces for people to actively worship, there was intention put into making sure that individuals upon their death had a burial that was suited to their faith. So you do also find that in different prisoner camps, they will have cemeteries dedicated. Large-scale camps would have their own cemeteries. And in smaller camps where there weren't, many times they might be buried in the village. But there was an intentionality to making sure that people received both military and, as they were able, the faith rites that reflected that individual. So again, this takeaway in World War I, that there was a humane effort to recognize the individual, and that even if they were on the other side, right, their sacrifice in war, that disillusionment is going to be in some ways a product of World War I, and certainly doubles over by the time you get through World War, you find the end of World War II, kind of that disillusionment in those spaces.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about the lack of documentation of the African soldiers, and I'm wondering, was there documentation about women and women as prisoners of war or in internment camps?
Yeah. There are far fewer women who are prisoners of war, but upon occasion, there are very few women who are serving as combatants. Russians, you have the Women's Battalion of Death that are serving in battle itself, but you have women around the world who are in support positions and the like. You do have women who are going to be brought in to that internment system with their spouses, with their families. In France, you're also going to see that women, if they break particular rules, especially if they were Romani or the like, that if they broke health code, that they would then be brought into these kind of prison camps as well. There weren't necessarily spaces that were dedicated to women prisoners.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to turn it back to you to continue with the presentation, and we'll do more questions at the end of the program.
Great. And friends, feel free to put questions in at any point in time into that space. Internment, yep. I asked you a question when we left, which was, did the United States have any internment camps? And the answer is yes, it absolutely does. Internment in the United States doesn't start with World War II and the Japanese. That actually starts in World War I with the Germans. And there are at least 4 camps, majority of them on the in the South. There's Arkansas, North Carolina, Georgia, located or close to forts, where individuals would and were kept from 1917 through 1918. You have about 1,000 of those who, at the end of the war, after they've been taken away from their businesses, after they are being held in camps, and in some instances camps that they needed to build, that some of those, less than 1,000, were repatriated back to Germany. There is some outstanding film footage of this, and I apologize I wasn't able to get that into the PowerPoint. There's some outstanding film footage of these American camps. I'll try to make sure that we could get a link to you all in a follow-up, where you can again check out our website, theworldwar.org. You'll see in the bottom right hand there's a link to our YouTube channel, and if you look beneath the archival film footage, you can see some of those things. But again, this internment, and here's an example of internees. This is going to happen on a very large scale basis. It doesn't only happen inside the United States, it happens inside India as well, where one of the largest internment camps occurred in a centuries old Indian fort. So there's some, again, tremendous opportunities. This is a really quick overview, guys. There's some tremendous opportunities to really see some of these fascinating stories and these fascinating individual stories out of the war. A basic life in a camp, as I mentioned to Kathleen, either you would be brought in right past some of these guards. There's a picture of a jacket. I just now realized it is right before we opened the exhibition, so there wasn't the space where we were mapping out where the label would be, but folks would be coming in right past kind of guards, and in some instances there would be these really large-scale camps that might have reading rooms, that would have a theater, a canteen, library, office, that there would be bunks, and really this intentionality for these hundreds of thousands of individuals to survive. Hundreds of thousands of individuals are going to be put to the war effort. There are laws that prevent them from being too close. On some instances, they are used close up to the front line and the like, and there can be significant mistreatment of prisoners. I strongly suggest you take a look at Heather Jones's book that really delves into that experience. Some of these large-scale camps, people created their own money, their own economic systems. We've got some letters that talk about what it was like. For example, this gentleman never wanted to see another carrot once he got out. But there's kind of in some instances, a lighter heartedness about that experience. And there's also this opportunity to engage with other individuals from other nations. This is a letter from Georgy Brashevich, who wrote to the mother of his American friend who he met in this space, and he was practicing his English. There are printing presses, there are classes that people organize so that, like Georgie, that people can learn new languages or practices other languages. Now, with such large scale fighting, you might wonder, how do they feed so many people? And that really comes back to another key point, which is the miracle of the international mail and of aid efforts. Across the globe, when all of a sudden you have 1.5 million individuals who are now being captured in 1915, you've got over 9 million by 1918. Places like the American Red, like the International Red Cross, start to send off packages. When individuals were brought into a camp, they would be registered, and that registration list would then be published. So people should, if everything went well, know whether or not their loved one was or was not in prison camp. Sometimes it would take weeks or months. Sometimes people thought their individual had passed, but actually the best of circumstances was that they would actually be found in a prison camp. If you were a family member of folks at this point in time, that was your hope. If all of a sudden you lost contact with your loved one. And you can see a really great example right here. This is something that's going to be very different than, say, if you go to the Pritzker's Museum, Pritzker Military Museum and Libraries exhibition. Things don't necessarily occur in the same way, that the majority of the food that is going to be sent, kind of that sustenance, is going to be provided by these different aid efforts, right? Like the American prisoners of war are being cared for by the Red Cross. And there are different rules by different nations about what could and what could not occur. And you have Americans who are going to be taking on German prisoners as an act of faith in some instances, that they felt that that was the humane way for them to kind of engage in these different spaces, that people would be sending these parcels. There's an example of objects that might be sent along the way to US soldiers, specifically in prisoner camps. I mentioned that there would be, that there were papers and presses that were provided for folks. Individuals made souvenirs. This was made by Turkish individuals that then they might have the opportunity to sell. Here is a gift from our collection of German prisoners of war in an American camp. So there's a lightheartedness that you don't necessarily associate that does occur, especially in some of these large scale camps around Europe. This certainly is not the experience of everyone, but this is an experience of many. And I'm going to go back actually to, right, and cartoons. This was a cartoon of what that, again, large scale experience was like. You can see images of people from different spaces and like trying to come up with a way to keep themselves entertained during what was for some a much longer imprisonment. You can also see an example, that guy right there who kind of flips over. He's got these wooden shoes that are falling off. As people were brought into camps, sometimes they were asked to give up their shoes and they would get wooden shoes instead to help keep them from running away. You can see again those examples all up and down that sketch of folks on the hillside. This could also then be repurposed and reused for others who needed to have shoes, who were on the front end of the fighting line. Again, there would be these well-established camps, particularly in Russia, or actually from Russia to Britain, theater performances, craft activities. These large-scale camps had their own hospital barracks where medical care was going to be provided to them. We've got some extraordinary letters of American nurses and doctors and what their experience is serving these individuals as they are trying to nurse them back to health. In these large-scale camps, there was organization where individuals could nominate their own leader, and that leader would speak to the leadership of the camp as well to try to organize as many good kind of keep things moving smoothly and well for everyone. International law stipulates that prisoners of war should be free to practice their religion in captivity. So prisoners from a variety of religions, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they're going to organize their own religious services in these different prisoners of war camps throughout the First World War. Sometimes you would even have like local ministers and folks who would come to the camp if there weren't some who were embedded there. We've got some examples of where Russian Jewish prisoners of war are going to celebrate Passover with the local German Jewish community. So there are these different stories that you don't necessarily hear about in these larger scale spaces. Now, not all individuals were kept in large scale spaces. Sometimes that there were camps that if they were remote enough, for example, in Turkey, individuals may just be placed in kind of abandoned housing or abandoned spaces, abandoned factories and the like, because there really wasn't as much opportunity for folks to escape. There's a wonderful new novel, and I apologize, I'm going to forget the name of it, right now that looks at two British prisoners of war in Germany, and how they actually use a Ouija board to escape. So you can look that up as well. And then there are other individuals who are going to be put into labor units, and those labor units are going to be moved around and moved around. And those are really some of the most dangerous. Those are individuals who are not going to be visited by the International Red Cross. They don't receive those same packages, so they don't get the same amount of food. If you were kind of embedded with families, like that also happened in Germany, where individuals would be sent to work on the fields and the like, a lot of the communities, especially in Germany, they're going to have, they have this ethical and this humane kind of neighborliness, where they're going to make sure, even if the military, the government's not providing the food, they're going to make sure that those in their care, on the most part, not on the individual level, but on the most part, are going to be well cared for. So you see this kind of echo again and again throughout World War I. Now, international law did stipulate that if you were an officer, you got to be in a completely different camp than an enlisted man. So here's a really good example. As you go through, and hopefully you take advantage of the online collections database of the National World War I Museum and Memorial, you can take a look for Philopolis. Right there, there's an extraordinary album that we have that really showcases what a individual officer experience was like, which was quite different from the enlisted man. We also, in some instances, and we explore this within the exhibition, people would hire oil portrait artists to paint their painting, to paint their portrait for them while they were imprisoned. So it was, they might also get Batman servants from kind of their own ranks of enlisted men who could continue to serve them during that time frame. So looking at that experience between an officer versus an enlisted man is a really important one. Before I leave this conversation about camps, I do need to make one really important point about health. That's one that kind of resonates today. The majority of prisoners captured, which I mentioned already, in World War I, they do survive their captivity, but that really does come down to two very important things. One, as I mentioned already, was this delivery of food to prisoners, and that happens across the world with these aid organizations, sometimes with governments and the like. This is extraordinary, but that helps ensure large-scale survival. The second really important one is hygiene controls implemented by the captors. There is this rise of, right, as we talked about earlier, kind of this new knowledge of science and germs and calories and all of these things happening around World War I. And people were trying to implement their best knowledge of the war, kind of science, with captivity, and they implemented a quarantine system of newly taken prisoners. They also implemented a vaccination procedure, which both combined really proved particularly effective because captor nations did that. For example, US soldiers were required to get vaccinations as they were heading in to service. Because those things happen, again, the majority of individuals are going to survive their prison experience. Again, I'm going to very quickly wrap through some of this. There is certainly a lot of labor activities, which I am glossing over. I'm giving some of the summary experience of captivity. And what I'm also really kind of glossing over is those experiences of not just home front labor, not frontline labor, and kind of the reprisals that happen, right? We mentioned already some of the large scale death, but you also have a variety of experience that do lead to individual and large scale deaths. And those World War I prisoner death rates are subject of historical debate. But prisoners captured by Germany late in the war had a higher risk of dying than those captured earlier in the war. The further east you were located as a captive in Europe, the higher risk of dying. You've got these specific spaces like the Murmansk Railway. You could have conversations about Armenia, but that's not technically a prisoner of war. because they weren't necessarily combatants. You've got the fall of Kutalamara. You've got the island of Asinara, where after being marched across a harrowing retreat across the Albanian mountains, Austro-Hungarian prisoners basically who have been captured by the Serbian army evacuate and are evacuated to Italy. A third of them die along this route. And then you also have these major kind of epidemics of typhus that occur as well. When the war on the Western Front ends with the Treaty of Versailles at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, you end up with the process of repatriation, sending people back home. It's a much larger, again, story. It takes a much longer period of time. Certainly doesn't happen right there in 1918. And you can find out more if you visit us online at theworldwar.org. Where I want to end us very quickly is actually on the story of Halliburton, Sergeant Edgar M. Halliburton. As you can see right there, I've given you a lot of things and a lot of conversations on large-scale trends, right? It's a global war. The majority of people survive their captivity experience, that it is the most commonly shared experience. But I started with the fact that it's individual. And so here is Edgar M. Halliburton. He's number one right there in that image. He is also the guy in this photo, in this statue, who is this statue. And he, in the war, he is one of the first he is one of the first Americans who is captured. That photograph that you see was actually sent out by Germans as propaganda, trying to dishearten the American public. Instead, what Americans do is they turn that into something to rally and to be a rallying cry, right? Captured but not conquered. And they create a statue. Only 5 of these exist. One of them ends the exhibition at our space. And Halliburton in particular, becomes this story of being not conquered, of courage, of honor, of patriotism, of sacrifice. His actual individual story is tremendous. While he's moved from camp to camp, he continues to rise as being a camp leader and doing wonderful things for those individuals who serve with them. When he ends his time in war, he is brought back, he comes back to the United States after the United States is part of, right, that winning side of the war, where they were part of the Allied powers, and for a while is known. And then the Great Depression happens, and he falls onto hard times like many others. Also has a hard time with a lot of his war experiences. You can read about that in his autobiography. While recognized, he was recognized on the job line, and because he was who had been made known, they brought him forward to get a job in that space, but he had a lot of mental health issues. And at the end of the book, he ends it with saying, basically cursing this statue, that really his story no longer belonged to himself, but belonged to museums and history, that he had been captured, and while not conquered, that his life was ever changed by this experience. And as you explore the autobiography, you can see in many ways not for the better. You can find out some more other stories like Charles de Gaulle, of individuals who were ever changed by this and brought that into spaces of leadership in World War II, on military sides, on others as well. Hopefully you've gotten a chance to learn some good stuff. Kathleen.
One thing that did strike me, just to have if you can give me a brief response, is we know there's a lot of propaganda film out of World War II. And were any of these films, like you showed us, or the cartoons and depictions, any part of propaganda on that front?
Absolutely. There is a significant amount of propaganda, of use of these stories to first try to inflame and try to make people angry. But as you can see, a great example of propaganda is actually the gifts that I showed you. Clearly, those are going to be American photographers who are taking these images to show how well Americans are treating German prisoners. And so in turn, you're also showing that as a kind of propaganda of we're treating your prisoners well, wouldn't you, you should be treating our prisoners well also. There's also a very complex story about 1/5 of Americans have who either are German immigrants or have German ancestry at this time frame. So there's a sense of familiarity for a lot of Americans with Germany as well. So it also plays to an internal American audience with images like that.
Thank you so much, Laura. On behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and our co-host, the National World War I Museum and Memorial, and our guest speaker, Lora Vogt, I'd like to thank you all for participating in today's webinar. And in the meantime, if you're in Chicago, please come visit our exhibit, Life Behind the Wire, Prisoners of War, or in Kansas City, you can see Captured on display at the National World War I Museum and Memorial. Both exhibits are closing in April of 2023. This concludes our program, and thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.